the coronavirus pandemic rolls on, it's not just affecting people's health, governments and economies around the world, it's having a huge impact on the environment too.
We need to tackle both the corona pandemic, this crisis, at the same time as we tackle the climate and environmental emergency.
Because these crises have collided, we have the responsibility to converge the solutions.
From shut down factories to grounded planes, changes in people's work, movements and consumption are all physically altering the world around us. Which means some people are asking, is this a kind of environmental silver lining in the middle of this terrible pandemic? Well, for a few months as the sky's clear, maybe yes. But let's take a look at how these short-term changes to air pollution, to economies and to the oil price, they may not make a difference in the long run. Within weeks of China shutting down major cities in Hubei province, researchers noticed that the air was getting cleaner. And how did they know this? Well, they could literally see it. Some types of pollution that harm our health, like nitrogen oxides or something called particulate matter, which is basically dust, can be seen from satellite cameras in space. NASA estimated that nitrogen dioxide, a gas which can cause respiratory problems and has been linked with lowering life expectancy, it fell in January and February in China by up to 30%. But then as the scale of the pandemic and the lockdowns grew, the European Space Agency, they noticed that between March and April, nitrogen dioxide levels were dropping in some European cities by around a half. And that this would happen makes sense. Under lockdown, people are travelling less and production of things like steel and cement are slowing right down, all of which produce these harmful gases. And in China, it already seems that as soon as the lockdown lifted, the pollution came back. And the relationship between the virus and air pollution may be circular. In several recent studies in both Europe and the US, researchers have found that people in more polluted regions are more likely to die from coronavirus. The idea is that air pollution was already causing respiratory problems before, so people's lungs are more susceptible to the virus when it arrives. So there's a clear link between the virus, air pollution and people's health. In theory, less economic activity means less pollution, and so if you're unharmed by the virus, you may be healthier, and it's likely to have benefits for other parts of nature too.
Oh, viens vers nous!
In the south of France, fin whales have been seen off the normally very busy coast of Marseille for the first time in years. Researchers assume that because there are less ships, there's less pollution, all of which entices the whales inshore. And there's countless other stories just like this.
The impacts on the air pollution are almost immediate, and you see it with your eyes. You see the blue sky all of a sudden, and the air is a lot cleaner. And that's because the pollution, there are particles, and they don't stay in the atmosphere very long at all. But greenhouse gases, they stay a lot longer. So you kind of accumulate over time because they don't disappear, in fact, the way pollution does.
So those same ships and those planes and those industries that are suddenly polluting less, they're also the same ones that emit greenhouse gases. Normally we have to wait a while to find out about greenhouse gas emissions in a given year, but experts have already begun to infer what this drop in travel and industrial activity might mean for the climate.
So the first estimates now are for decreasing emissions this year by 5%, which in fact is a lot, but the emissions have been increasing year on year, 1% every year. So, a 5% drop is maybe equivalent to 5 years.
Other experts like the International Energy Agency have put the figure slightly higher at 8%. Whatever the exact figure turns out to be, it's clear that there'll be a short-term benefit for the climate while the world's under lockdown. In fact, most experts expect that it'll be the biggest single drop in greenhouse gas emissions ever. But let's look back a bit, because the emissions fall in times of crises, it's nothing new. The Spanish flu, World War II, the energy crisis of the late 1970s, these were all major economic events that saw huge drops in emissions. Even after the financial crisis 10 years ago, there was a drop in emissions of 1.4%, and a collapse in oil demand played a huge part in that. But what we're seeing today with coronavirus has never happened before. People aren't travelling so much, so not many need fuel, and industrial activity is slowed down to a snail's pace, all of which means less oil. And so we've seen oil prices drop to historic lows, sometimes even going negative, which means somebody will literally pay you to take the oil off their hands. Some experts think that this will bring forward a landmark moment which has been talked about for decades: peak oil demand. This is the highest point of the world's oil use, after which we use less and less, and it's seen as a key moment in the global transition to green energy. Before the pandemic, most experts thought that peak oil demand would come sometime in the next 10 years. But now they're wondering whether demand will ever recover, and in fact the pandemic could mean we've already seen peak demand sometime in 2019. All of this was unthinkable at the start of the year, and that's a good thing for the climate, right? Well, let's go back to Professor Le Carré and find out what happened after the financial crisis.
There we had a drop in emissions of 1.5%, in 2009, and immediately 2010 we had a rebound of 5%, and by the time the crisis was finished, it was like if it hadn't existed at all in terms of emissions.
Now that's because economic activity was turbocharged back into action and everything went back to how it was before, including emissions.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
With coronavirus, although we may see the biggest short-term drop in greenhouse gas emissions ever, at a UN climate conference in Paris in 2015, countries agreed to try and limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And despite all the job losses and national shutdowns, experts still aren't sure whether this emissions drop will be enough to hit that internationally agreed target.
For climate change itself, it's not doing very much directly at all. I mean, this drop is a forced drop because we can't go to work and we can't consume or anything. But as soon as the confinement will be lifted, then, we'll likely go back to what we used to do before. You really need to change in the long term, day to day, on and on. So structural changes from the car to public transport or cycling and walking, that kind of thing.
So while the whales coming back are the short-term results of physics in the air and chemistry in the sea, the long-term fate of carbon emissions after the pandemic rely on something much less certain: economics, politics, and people. Here, the pandemic could change everything about our relationship with fossil fuels, with emphasis on the could. For some analysts, this is the start of the end of our relationship with oil, and for others, the cheap price just might mean that afterwards people take advantage and buy more. So how do we make sense of experts making such different predictions? Well, oil prices and the markets they're sold on, they're not detached systems with fixed rules like the science of climate change. Governments and officials make decisions which shape them, and unlike science, these are much harder to predict.
So, climate and health, we know, are intimately related. We're, very slowly finding out that actually what caused, in fact, this health crisis had a lot to do with how we treat the environment, how we treat the animals around us, how we organize production. So in that sense, they're intimately related. But what's very interesting is that both with climate and with health, it always requires an extreme event for government sometimes to really come in kind of full on, whether it was the floods in Venice, the fires in Canada and Australia, and now the COVID crisis. You don't necessarily hear governments saying, oh, well, we can't do it because there's no, say, tax revenue. They actually create money in order to tackle those crises.
So this is about politics too. One impact of the virus has already been the postponement of a major UN climate conference that was supposed to be happening in Glasgow later this year. This is where most of the major decisions on climate action will be taken. But much more immediately, many people are arguing that the pandemic is a chance to reset the global economy with the climate at the centre, and the government should use any help they give struggling industries to reshape how they operate, for example by attaching environmental conditions to any handouts.
Given that the companies need kind of emergency measures now, making sure that there's conditions that a particular company in a sector actually makes those investments that allow it to lower, again, its carbon emissions. I just think that's obvious, but also in terms of making sure that the workers don't lose their jobs. I mean, this is what they've done in Denmark. I think it's a very important policy to potentially copy, which is that in order for the recovery to be as smooth as possible, by not laying off workers, in some ways government helping companies pay the wage bill, but the workers not going to work, means that when the recovery begins, those workers can immediately go back.
But so far, countries like Denmark seem to be an outlier, because businesses that stand to lose from such conditions won't give up their profits so easily. In the US, there's already been a litany of movements by high-polluting sectors to take advantage of the pandemic. Corporate lobbying saw the lifting of a string of environmental protections by US regulators. And as part of a $2 trillion economic recovery package, $500 billion was given to companies with very few strings attached, including $60 billion for airlines. Even oil and gas companies are pressuring governments to help. That's despite huge executive bonuses and trillions of dollars globally in public subsidies.
How the current health crisis plays itself out depends on how the remedies to the crisis are structured. Any sort of support, whether it's to households or businesses, isn't neutral. It all depends on, the if you want, conditions also attached, for example, with business.
In Europe, many senior figures are talking quite ambitiously when it comes to coronavirus and climate. Following the postponement of the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow, Frans Timmermans, who's the Executive Vice President of the European Green Deal, said, "Bailout should all be linked with clear conditions, that the money will be used for a green economy and a green society." Let's be clear, very few are suggesting that airlines and the many thousands of jobs they support shouldn't be helped. But across Europe, airline companies have applied for loans totaling nearly 30 billion euros and counting, with no legally binding environmental conditions attached. Here in the UK, EasyJet has already secured a loan of £600 million from the government. And more widely, the Bank of England has come under fire for including fossil fuel companies in their financial support measures. But it's not about whether government support is given, it's about how and on what conditions.
So there's a real opportunity right now to use the COVID crisis, and I know the word opportunity is terrible to use in the context of a tragedy, but it's an opportunity in the sense that government has a strong negotiating hand and can actually transform much quicker than it would have otherwise been able to. There's some governments that are being very ambitious on this level, and others that are just saying, no, it doesn't matter.
So companies will be hit hard during this pandemic, and workers in even the most polluting sectors need to be protected. But experts agree, this could be a moment to make structural changes which mean emissions don't go up like they have done before, and that for our polluted cities and for the climate, going back to normal shouldn't be an option.